The bell tower had stood for nearly 3 centuries in the quiet town of Elmsworth, its stones worn smooth by time, weather, and the passage of countless watchmen. It wasn't tall by cathedral standards, just 5 floors, but it was high enough to rise above the slate rooftops and whispering trees. It watched over narrow cobbled lanes, over gardens that curled with herbs and roses, over the gentle curve of the distant river. And at its peak, it held a bell. This bell, cast in 1342, had never once missed the mark of an hour. It rang not to alarm nor to command, but to remind. To remind the people that time, like breath, is steady, that the sun rises, that it will fall again, and that the world, no matter what else it may forget, always turns on time. Tonight, the bell tower would be watched by a man named Thomas. Thomas was neither young, nor old, neither tall, nor particularly short. He had a beard he rarely trimmed, and eyes like river glass clear, but always drifting. He wore a deep green woolen coat and gloves with the fingers missing. His boots were scuffed at the toes from pacing, and in his satchel he carried 2 things: a small lantern trimmed in brass and a journal wrapped in soft, ink-stained leather. The tower creaked gently as he climbed the wooden steps, the same ones his grandfather had climbed, and his grandfather before him. Each step made a hollow sound like the low call of a sleeping bird. The stone walls around him breathed coolness. The lantern swung in his hand, casting an amber glow over old carvings and notches scratched into the support beams. Dates, initials, small marks of passing time. He reached the top just before the hour. Outside, the sky was a blanket of indigo, deepening to black at the edges. Stars were beginning to blink into place like soft lanterns hung above a sleeping town. The moon, round and low, rose slowly over the horizon, climbing like a pearl out of the river's edge. Thomas stepped into the belfry, where the wind moved in gentle spirals, carrying the scent of iron and ivy and stone. The bell hung above him, still and patient, its curve catching moonlight. He touched its side with one hand, a ritual, a reassurance, and then sat on the low bench beneath it. He took out his journal, opened it to the first empty page, and began to write midnight quiet stars overhead. The baker's cat on the wall again smelled rosemary near the northwest parapet. He wrote not just what he saw, but what he felt, what he remembered. The things that only happened when the town was asleep and no one else was watching. The watchman's job was not to shout or warn or sound alarm. It was to observe, to keep the hold, and so the night passed. He heard a shutter bang loose and tighten itself again. He watched as a fox padded across the square and disappeared behind the blacksmith's cart. He saw a candle flicker in the apothecary window, though no one lived there now, not since the autumn 2 years ago. When the leaves had turned red far too early, he did not question it. He simply wrote it down. In the old days, the bell tower had 3 watchers, each taking a shift. But now it was only Thomas, and the town did not mind. They said his presence was enough, that with Thomas in the tower, the hours kept their rhythm and the nights never strayed into mischief. And though no one ever said it out loud, many believed the bell rang more purely when Thomas watched it. Half past the hour, a faint hush spread through the village, a lull in the wind, a pause in the distant rustle of leaves. Thomas leaned forward slightly, as though listening for something. Buried in the silence, he closed his eyes and took in the sound of nothing. But within that nothing was everything. The flutter of wings against the eaves, the creak of an old weather vane turning west, the faint groan of earth cooling under night. Each sound settled him deeper into the moment. Years ago, Thomas had been a scholar in the city. He studied texts older than the bell itself, bound in cracked vellum and scented with mold and secrets. He had spent his days reading and translating, cataloging the past until the present slipped away. But one evening, while reading an obscure passage about the hollow hours, a term few had ever heard, he felt something shift. A sentence in the margins had caught his eye. To keep the watch is to weave the dream. He left the city the next day and came home to Elmsworth. When asked why, he only said, "The tower called," and the townsfolk nodded as if they understood. Now, as the hour approached, Thomas stood and stepped toward the bell. He placed his hand upon the pull rope and waited. When the moment came, he gave it a gentle tug, not hard, not rushed. The bell moved with grace, swaying like an old friend stretching after a long nap. Its tone rang out low, full, and resonant. It rolled through the streets like warm water seeping into every doorstep and down every chimney. It echoed off the hills, reached the river, and drifted upward into the sky. The sound was not loud. It was deep, and those who heard it in their sleep dreamed sweeter dreams. Afterward, Tomas sat again. He poured a small cup of tea from a flask in his bag, sipped it slowly, and watched the town as though it were a living map. There was the baker's awning curled like a parchment scroll. The cobbler's stoop worn smooth at the edges from decades of shoes, waiting the well in the square with a hawthorn tree growing beside, in its branches moving even when the air was still. And farther off, just beyond the old gate, barely visible, was the edge of the forest, dark, quiet, and patient. Tomas had never feared the forest. Not the way the children did when they told stories of shadow beasts and whispering trees. To him, it was simply older than understanding. And older things were worth listening to. He looked again at the bell. If you listened closely, even after it rang, it seemed to hum. Not as a sound, but as a feeling beneath the ribs. He had asked his grandfather once, "What does the bell really do?" The old man had smiled, his beard full of crumbs, and said, "It holds the town in place." Tomas hadn't understood then, but he was starting to. The night deepened. A mist began to creep low through the lanes, silvering the cobblestones. The stars brightened, clustering like kindling in the sky. And Tomas closed his journal for the moment. He leaned against the wall, pulled his coat closer, and let his eyes drift, just enough to blur the world, but not to sleep. A watchman never sleeps. He only dreams with his eyes open. The hours passed like water slipping between fingers. Time had a different shape from the top of the bell tower. It did not march or tick. It did not push or pull. It simply drifted quietly on the wind. Tomas sipped the last of his tea, letting the warmth settle in his chest. The sky above the village deepened to a richer black, studded with stars so bright they seemed to pulse. Every so often a shooting star would leave a silver trail for just a moment before melting into the quiet. He stood again, stretching slowly. A creak from the floorboards echoed below. A breeze curled around his legs, whispering like the hem of an old song. He stepped outside onto the narrow ledge that ringed the belfry, the town stretching out beneath him like a quilt stitched from centuries of sleep. He let his eyes roam from rooftop to rooftop, chimney to garden wall. Every detail felt familiar, yet never dull. The weather vane above the herbalist's cottage still pointed west, even though the wind had long since turned south. A single candle flickered behind the glass of the old chapel, its flame steady as if guarded by a silent prayer. Tomas closed his eyes and listened. The bell tower itself made a sound, not just the low groans of its timbers or the creak of age, but a deeper resonance. The stones held memory. They remembered footsteps and silences and songs hummed long ago beneath breathless skies. He returned inside and opened his journal again. The page caught the moonlight as he began to write. 1 o'clock, soft mist rising from the well. Fox returned the same path. Rose scent stronger tonight. Must be the wind curling in from the garden wall. He paused, thinking not with worry or effort, but with stillness. His pen hovered over the page, not searching, but listening for the next moment to arrive. And then it came far below from the edge of the forest. There was the sound of a flute. Just a few notes, clear, calm, not meant to be heard, only to be released. Tomas tilted his head as if to better taste the air. Was it real? Perhaps, but in Elmsworth, some things existed only in the spaces between sleep and story. He wrote it down anyway. The flute returns, faint, familiar, same melody as the night of frost 2 winters past. He remembered that night. The frost had crept in, silently turning leaves to silver before anyone noticed. The bell had sounded crisper, then sharper, as if ringing against glass. Instead of waking him, it had lulled him deeper into watching, deeper into that space where sound and dream wove together. And the flute had played that night too. The townsfolk spoke of watchers like Tomas with reverence and affections. Some believed watchers could see things others could not. Some said they kept nightmares at bay, not by fighting them but by observing them calmly until they faded. Others believed that watchers listened to time itself, that they could hear, the years creaking like branches in the wind. Whatever the truth the villagers trusted, Tomas not with loud praises, but with small gestures. A basket of bread left by his door, a woolen scarf on the hook. A note slipped between the pages of his old books. "Stay warm," it said. "The cold is kinder when noticed." Sometime near the second hour, a soft rapping echoed through the tower, not loud. Just 3 taps as if someone were knocking politely at a memory. Tomas Rose walked slowly down the spiral staircase and paused on the 3rd landing. There in the stone wall, a small wooden hatch was set into the rock. He opened it. Inside was a shelf carved directly into the stone. On it rested a folded scrap of parchment. A bell symbol drawn in ink marked the corner. He took it upstairs, opened it by lantern light, and read. "The hawthorn blooms early this year. Check the garden wall and thank you." No name, no signature. Just a note from someone who saw what Tomas saw. Someone who also watched, even if only from the shadows. He smiled, set the note aside, and marked the entry in his journal. 3rd landing message received hawthorn blooming early. Must check weather patterns against almanac windwarm for this time of year. Thank you, whoever you are. He returned to the bell and gently brushed a finger along its edge. He didn't ring it yet. It wasn't tea time, but the touch was enough. A silent nod between 2 ancient friends. The wind changed direction. It now carried a different scent, not the herbs and stones of Elmsworth, but something older, earthier. It smelled like moss, warmed by candlelight, or books whose spines had softened from being opened too often. It smelled like stories. Tomas breathed it in, letting it settle in his lungs and chest and bones. He let it anchor him gently to this moment, not pulling, but wrapping around like the weight of a blanket just before sleep. He sat again on the bench, feeling the hours thicken like slow honey. The town below did not stir, and yet so much was happening. A pair of mice danced in the shadows of the bakery. The painter's cat chased streams along the rooftop, swiping at starlight. A door opened on the far edge of the village, releasing the smell of ginger and oak into the night. And above it all the stars watched in silence. He wrote again, 2 o'clock mice near bakery cat on rooftop. Starlight unusually bright tonight. Could it be the bell? He meant the feeling, not the sound. The bell did something to the air when Tomas was present. It made light bend a little slower, made mist move more gently. It held the hour in place like a leaf balanced on still water. The ledge outside the tower was beginning to frost over, not with harsh ice but with a delicate shimmer. Tomas stepped out and ran a gloved hand along the railing. The frost sang under his fingers, a soft crackle like distant applause. Below the garden wall glowed faintly in the moonlight. A soft shape stirred there, not moving, but unfolding. Tomas leaned closer. It was the hawthorn tree. And yes, it was blooming, pale blossoms trembling slightly in the breeze. He closed his eyes, letting the image root inside him. He would write it down later, but for now he simply watched. That was the thing about watching. It wasn't about reacting, it was about bearing witness. Noticing the changes, the shifts, the patterns so gentle they could only be seen in stillness. A memory stirred in him, then unbidden but welcome. He was a boy again, sitting on the 3rd step of the tower beside his grandfather. The man had handed him a tiny brass bell and whispered, "Try to hear it ring without ringing it." Tomas had frowned, puzzled. His grandfather tapped his chest and said, "The sound is already there. You just have to be quiet enough to let it rise." Years later, Tomas would understand. The bell was not only a tool, it was a memory held in metal. A silence wrapped around a sound, waiting to be heard again. The bell rang at the hour. Tomas pulled the rope gently, and the great shape swayed in solemn rhythm. The sound was not only in the air. It was in the ground, in the rooftops, in the sky itself. Somewhere far below, a baby shifted in sleep and smiled. Somewhere near the forest line, the flute played again, no louder than a breath. And in the tower, Tomas watched, eyes open, heart still and quiet and full. He whispered aloud, though no one could hear him. 3 o'clock. Stillness holding. Dreams blooming early. The third hour stretched long and low across the rooftops of Elmsworth. The sky no longer shimmered with stars, but held them steady, as if pressing them gently into place. A kind of stillness had settled, not of absence, but of fullness. The world below was asleep completely and contentedly, and the bell tower above held that sleep like a vessel filled to the brim. Tomas sat with his back against the stone pillar, his lantern flickering near his boots. Its light cast a soft golden hue over the wooden floor, painting gentle waves of brightness and shadow that moved as if breathing. The journal lay close beside him, resting as if it too needed the pause. He listened again to the flute drifting from the trees. Though the sound was barely there, it tugged gently at something within him. A memory, perhaps, or a dream not yet dreamed. He did not try to name it. Naming things pulled them into the daylight, and this was an hour for shadows and suggestion. He rose slowly and stepped back onto the ledge, the air now thick with a silver mist that made edges blur and shapes soften. The rooftops below wore soft halos of moonlight. The chimneys exhaled warmth into the sky, and everything shimmered with the delicate glow of fog catching firelight. A sudden flutter broke the hush. Wings beat above his head. A barn owl drifted silently past its flight, so smooth it seemed suspended in a dream. Tomas followed it with his eyes as it curved gently toward the fields, then disappeared beyond the edge of the chapel roof. He whispered to the owl, though it was long gone, "Safe flight," and smiled. Down in the village, the lamps that burned through the earlier hours had now gone dark. The baker's shutters were closed tightly, the last of the warmth from his ovens curling out into the cold. The old carpenter's window glowed faintly, but Tomas knew it was only moonlight reflected in old warped glass. He turned to look out past the town over the hills and toward the dark stretch of forest beyond the wall. There was a soft haze hovering above the tree line. Not smoke, not clouds, something more like memory. The kind of haze that arrives in stories or in dreams right before something is revealed. The bell behind him remained still, but it seemed to hum again, not with sound, but with resonance, a presence, a breath. He walked toward it and gently placed a hand along the bell's curve, feeling the cool metal pulse softly under his fingers, not like a heartbeat, more like a thought that had not yet formed, a kindness unspoken, a reminder. You are here. You are awake. You are watching. Inside the belfry, he pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and took a long, slow breath. The scent of the lantern mixed with cool mist and ancient wood created a perfume of comfort and time. It reminded him of his childhood, before he ever became a watchman, before he knew what the tower really was. He remembered a night when his mother had taken him by the hand and led him into the garden where the hawthorn tree now bloomed too early. She had held a candle in a cup of blue glass and whispered to him, "Look at the stars, Tomas. They are the same ones your grandfather watched, and his grandfather before him. That's how you know you are never truly alone." He had not understood then, but he had remembered. And now, standing in the same air, touching the same stone, he understood perfectly. A soft knock echoed again, but this time it came not from the third landing. It came from below, from the entrance to the tower. Thomas tilted his head. The sound was not forceful nor urgent. It was almost uncertain, like someone knocking on a door within. A dream, he descended the stairs quietly, boots brushing dust from ancient steps. The lantern cast shadows that flickered along the walls, dancing between notches and initials carved long ago. When he reached the base, he paused. The heavy wooden door remained shut, but a small envelope had been slipped beneath its frame. It rested in the lantern glow, pale cream, sealed with a drop of wax, marked not with a bell this time, but with a feather. Tomas crouched, picked it up, and turned it over carefully. The wax was warm, as if recently pressed. He returned to the top without opening it yet, simply feeling its presence like an unspoken word waiting for breath. He sat beneath the bell, broke the seal gently, and opened the letter. Inside was a single line written in soft script. Not all watchers stand in towers. He read it again, then folded it neatly and placed it inside his journal. There was no fear in the message. No. Mystery meant to be solved, only a quiet reminder that he was not the only one listening. That somewhere out there, perhaps among the hills or hidden in the forest, someone else kept the night in balance in their own way. He wrote in the journal once more. 4th hour letter beneath the door. No-name feather seal words familiar in their stillness. Someone else watches too, perhaps not from a tower, but from the heart. The bell rang again, not loudly, not abruptly. It moved as if stirred by thought alone. Tomas did not pull it this time, not with his hand, not with his arm, but with his breath. A breath in and out timed so gently that the bell simply knew. The sound rolled over the town like fog dipped in gold. It touched every rooftop, every bed, every soul breathing under blankets and beams and stars. And the village sighed as one. Tomas leaned his head back against the stone and closed his eyes not to sleep, but to drift. The air had grown colder now, but the chill was not biting. It was crisp and clear, like the first page of a book about to be written. He saw in his mind the hawthorn tree, its blossoms trembling. He saw the owlet's wings folding into silence. He saw the stars not above, but within, as if they lived behind his ribs, twinkling softly with every breath. And he saw the bell, its presence, its patience, its pulse. "You are here," the tower whispered. "You are the thread between dreams and dawn." The 5th hour neared, and with it came a quiet sense of arrival, as if the night itself was slowly gathering all it had witnessed, placing it gently into Tomas's hands to be held remembered and released. He rose again for one final walk around the ledge. The fog had lifted, just slightly revealing the gentle curve of the hills, the sleepy outlines of cottages, the soft glitter of frost catching on rooftops. The world looked painted tonight, not real, not imagined, but somewhere in between. A low sound echoed from the forest. Not a threat, not even a word. Just a tone low and deep and ancient. He did not react. He did not fear. He simply nodded and said aloud, "I hear you," and then returned to the bell. Tomas stood beneath the great bell, his fingers still resting against the cool curve of its side. The air had grown very still, as though the entire tower were holding its breath with him. Even the mist outside the narrow windows had paused in its curling, its drifting, hanging softly like veils of thought not yet spoken. The 5th hour neared, and with it, a hush deeper than any other. This was the hour the old watchers used to call the breathing hour, when the world, they believed, drew its deepest sigh. Tomas had always thought that poetic, something passed down in the guild to make the long nights feel less lonely. But standing now in this stillness, he felt it to be true, not just in thought, but in the marrow of his bones. The night was breathing, slowly, deeply, and he with it. He stepped out once more to the ledge. The fog had lifted more now, revealing new shapes in the hills. A cluster of trees that had looked like a single shadow earlier now unfolded into distinct trunks, each leaning slightly inward like old friends in conversation. A narrow path revealed itself winding from the village to the east and disappearing into the woods. Tomas watched that path with quiet attention. No one walked it tonight, but it felt alive, waiting, like a sentence not yet spoken aloud. Inside the belfry, the shadows had changed. They no longer flickered with movement, but stretched in long, gentle curves across the wooden floor, like the folds of a blanket wrapping the tower in warmth. He sat again, drawing his knees up and resting his back against the wall. The lantern glowed steady beside him, its flame no longer dancing, just resting. He picked up the journal again, not to write just yet, but to turn its pages. Some were filled with neat script, others with smudges, quick sketches of rooftops or bells, or the occasional feather pressed flat between the pages. He paused on one such page, where a single pressed leaf had been carefully tucked beneath a line of poetry written by a watcher long before him. A bell is not a call to wake. It is the hush between what was and what comes. He read the line slowly 3 times, letting its shape settle into him. Then he closed the book and looked once more toward the path in the forest. From somewhere beyond the trees, far past the path's end, came a sound. Not sharp, not sudden. Just a low tone, like the soft hum of a bowl touched by a fingertip. It was not quite a note, and not quite a voice, but Tomas felt it stir something in his chest. He leaned forward slightly. The sound came again, and with it, the softest echo of bells. Not metal, not rung, but whispered. As though the forest had bells hidden within it that did not swing or toll, but breathed sound out like fog. He did not rise. He simply listened. Not every sound was meant to be followed. Some were just meant to be received, like dreams or snowfall. A rustle stirred on the stair. He turned his head calmly, not startled, only curious. A soft shape emerged. It was the village cat, a long-limbed gray creature with tufts of white on its paws and chest. It padded forward, tail high, eyes like 2 pale moons. Tomas smiled, stretching a hand out. The cat rubbed against him before curling into a neat spiral near the lantern, blinking slowly, then closing its eyes. The warmth from the flame touched its fur and made it glow slightly, as if outlined in golden thread. For a long while, Tomas watched the cat sleep. The sound of its breathing blended with the hush of the tower, and for a moment, there was no difference between man and animal, watcher and watched. Just breath and warmth and the slow turning of the world. He wrote in the journal again. 5th hour forest breathes. Cat arrived again. Sat with me. Watched the dark become deeper and kind. A single bell sounded far away, not from the tower, but from somewhere below, near the chapel perhaps. One low chime. Then silence. It was not a warning. It was not a timekeeper. It was a note, placed in the silence like a leaf set gently on water. Tomas did not move. He only acknowledged it, in his body, in his stillness. That was all that was required. He thought of the letter again, the feather seal. Not all watchers stand in towers. Perhaps that bell below had been rung by one of them. Another keeper of the breath between hours. The idea comforted him, not in a loud or grand way, but like a quilt pulled over cold feet. The clouds had shifted slightly now, revealing more of the sky. A few stars still blinked lazily between strips of moonlight, and one bright planet sat low near the horizon, pulsing softly like a guardian lantern. Tomas rose once more. The bell tower was quiet now, but awake, always awake. He walked the full circle of the ledge, his steps slow and measured, each one met by the creak of old boards and the rustle of his cloak. Below, the town slumbered, and above, the bell stood ready, not to wake, but to remind. He paused at the eastern archway, where the path into the woods had shown itself earlier. The trees there were now black silhouettes, the mist drawn back into the shadows. He could not see the end of the path, nor did he need to. Some things were not meant to be reached. They were meant to be remembered. The bell behind him gave a slight groan, as though shifting in its cradle. He turned, walked back inside, and reached for the rope. Not to ring it fully, but to steady it. To place his hand upon its rhythm and be part of its stillness. He wrote once more. 6th hour. The tower is full of breath and stars. Something in the wood sings. It does not call me. It reminds me. The cat sleeps. The bell waits. And then he closed the journal, leaned his head back against the stone, and let the night hold him. Tomas did not sleep, but his thoughts slowed as though dreaming. He sat, listening not only with his ears, but with his whole presence. The air in the bell tower was growing cooler now, not cold, but tinged with the silver hush of approaching dawn. Somewhere far in the east, beyond the hills and the forest, the first hint of light was beginning its slow ascent. It was not yet visible, but it whispered its coming in the way the wind shifted and the way the owl no longer called. The cat, still curled beside the lantern, stirred slightly and tucked its nose beneath its paw. Thomas stretched out his legs, the ache of the long watch soft and familiar in his muscles. He thought of all the other towers like this one, spread across the kingdom, some grand with marble staircases and polished brass bells, others humble, built of fieldstone and wood. Each had its own watcher, someone like him, someone awake while the world slept. He had met a few of them over the years, at gatherings once held in the midsummer days, where tower keepers came together to trade stories, sharpen tools, and share the strange dreams that sometimes came in the seventh hour. That was always what they called it, the dreaming hour. A soft wind slipped through the tower's high window, stirring the pages of the journal and lifting the edge of Thomas's cloak. He stood and turned toward the open archway, letting the breeze touch his face. It smelled faintly of wet stone, morning dew, and something else something like lavender, though no such flowers grew this high. The wind had traveled far, carrying stories with it. Not all could be heard, but some could be felt. He closed his eyes and let the wind pass through him. He opened the journal and wrote again. Seventh hour. The dreaming begins wind from the east. Smells like stories. The tower listens. Then he smiled. A soft sound, almost a laugh but more of a hum, rose in his throat. He rarely laughed alone, but tonight the tower felt almost like company. The journal closed with a whisper, the parchment folding gently together. Thomas looked out again. The stars had begun to fade. Not vanish, but dim. It was always strange to see them go, not because it was sad, but because it was quiet. They disappeared the way candle flames did when cupped by breath. Gently, respectfully, as if bowing out of a story not their own. He began his descent from the bell platform, step by step, letting his hand trail along the smooth stone of the tower wall. The steps had been worn by centuries of watchers, boots, sandals, bare feet in summer, even children once, in the days when towers were family duties passed from parent to child. He reached the mid-level where a wooden bench and a small window opened onto the rooftops. He sat and watched the tiles below slowly change color from midnight blue to softened gray, touched by the breath of morning. Below, a chimney puffed gently. Someone was stirring early, perhaps a baker, or the widow who always rose before the sun to water her herbs. Thomas imagined the smell of bread and rosemary, the warmth of a fire crackling into life, the clink of pottery mugs being set down. He did not need to see these things to feel them. The tower let him sense the village as if it were a single slow heartbeat. Every action below sent a ripple upward, and every breath he took felt, in turn, like part of their rhythm. From the stairs behind him came the soft sound of claws on stone. The cat had followed. It jumped lightly onto the bench beside him, pressed its head into his side, and then turned 3 tight circles before settling. Thomas scratched gently behind its ears. The two of them sat like sentinels, not guarding, just observing. A bell far in the south rang once, then silence. Not all towers struck the hour with full tolls. Some used single notes, others subtle chimes. It was a custom passed from region to region, shaped by weather, tradition, or the preference of the bell itself. Thomas had always believed each bell had its own mood. Some were proud, others reluctant, and a few like the one he'd tend was serene. He stayed on the bench for a long time, until the rooftops brightened further and shadows retreated into alleyways and under eaves. The mist had nearly vanished now, rising upward in slow spirals before fading. As the light crept in, so did the quiet sounds of life, the creak of shutters opening, the flap of laundry being hung, the first notes of a flute being practiced 2 streets over. He would wait until the bell's shadow on the tower wall reached a certain point before descending fully. That was the quiet watcher's rule. Never leave too soon, never wait too long. Leave with the rhythm. The bell itself did not toll at dawn. It never had. Dawn was not an hour to declare, but to receive. When he returned to the platform, the cat following closely, he found a single beam of golden light slicing through the tower's topmost archway. It fell across the bell, catching on the smallest etchings in its surface. The old runes carved centuries ago by monks, who believed bells could hold prayers even when silent. He stepped into the light. It warmed his face and hands. For a moment, everything inside the tower gleamed, the dust in the air, the brass of the lantern, the silken edges of the journal spine. He felt not awake nor asleep, but held in a moment that needed nothing more. He opened the journal once more. 8th hour light has arrived quietly. Bell glows in silence. The tower exhales, I am part of it. And with that, he closed the book for the day, picked up the lantern, and descended. The door at the base of the tower creaked open into a world both familiar and new. The village was waking. And above, the bell waited for night to come again. The day passed quietly, like a river under a thin veil of fog. Though the village of Elmsworth stirred with its usual rhythm, children running through garden paths, carts creaking over cobblestones, and distant laughter rising from the square, it all felt muffled through Tomas's senses, as if the watchful part of him never fully returned to the daylight. He walked slowly through the lanes in the early afternoon, his boots crunching gently on the scattered gravel that lined the southern walkway. Heads nodded to him as he passed, a silent acknowledgement that he was the one who watched. He smiled and returned each gaze with a calm warmth, but his thoughts still floated like mist around the tower. He paused beside the hawthorn tree again. Its blossoms had held through the night, delicate and pale, yet strong enough to resist the early breeze. He touched one bloom gently with a gloved finger and imagined it recording the wind in its petals, as if the flower were a page in its own quiet journal. As he walked away, a young boy ran past him, grinning wide, a wooden sword in his hand. He stopped briefly, turned back, and whispered, "Thank you for keeping the monsters away," before darting off again. Tomas chuckled, the kind of low, soundless laugh that rises only when the heart is still. By evening, he had returned to the tower, climbing each step slowly, breathing in the scent of dust, stone, and fading sunlight. The air inside was cooler than outside, as though the tower had been saving the chill from the night before. He greeted the bell softly, brushing its base with the back of his fingers, and then lit the lantern again, its glow filling the space with amber comfort. He took his seat beside the window, opened the journal, and wrote, "Night returns with a golden hush. The bell feels ready. The hawthorn still blooms. The child saw what I keep quiet. Maybe that's the point." He left the book open this time, letting the ink dry slowly as he watched the village darken once again. Chimneys exhaled ribbons of smoke, windows bloomed with candlelight, and the streets emptied gently, as though the ground itself was calling people home. It was the kind of evening that wrapped around the world like a woolen cloak, thick and soft and full of dreams. The cat returned not long after. No sound announced its arrival, only the quiet brush of fur against wood and the soft thump of paws landing on the bench beside Tomas. He reached out, and the cat pressed its head against his wrist before settling down, eyes half-lidded and tail twitching slowly. Tomas whispered, I know, and they both looked out toward the east. The wind had changed again. It now carried the scent of smoke and sage, and something else Tomas couldn't place a scent like pages turning or old books opening themselves after a long time. It wasn't from the village. It came from the forest. And just as he leaned forward, curious, the flute played again. Fainter this time, almost hesitant. It wasn't the same melody as before, but it was familiar, like a variation on a lullaby. He listened, not moving, and let it play until it faded into the wind. He opened the journal and wrote again. Flute returned. A new melody, slower, sadder. The wind listens with me. The cat has not left. I think the forest remembers me now. At the stroke of the 9th hour, the bell rang once. Not from his hand, not from any motion he made. It rang by itself, as it sometimes did. A single low tone that felt like it came from beneath the stone, from below the earth, as if the bell were speaking not to the air, but to time itself. The note echoed through the tower, through the bones of the village, and beyond. Tomas closed his eyes and let the sound wash through him. He stood and walked the circle of the tower again. From this height, the stars had begun to gather. The moon, barely more than a crescent, lay like a boat drifting across the sky, tilting slowly westward. Below, the town was still and sleeping. No lights flickered now. No doors opened. Only the occasional hoot of a distant owl reminded him that the night was shared. As he returned to his seat, the cat followed closely, jumping into his lap this time. Thomas chuckled again and stroked its back slowly, feeling the steady rhythm of its breath. He leaned his head back against the wall and whispered aloud, "If there are monsters, I think they are lonely, and that is why we watch." He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to drift deeper into the breath of the tower. Somewhere in that stillness, he saw the image of the bell floating on a dark lake, its shape surrounded by tiny lanterns. Figures stood on the far banks, each holding a candle, each watching the bell in silence. And just as suddenly, the vision passed. He wrote again. 9th hour. The bell speaks on its own. The flute mourns. A vision of watchers I have never met, but feel I know. Something is gathering. The air shifted again. Not a gust. Just a change, like the inhalation before a word. And then, from far down the stairs, there came a sound. Not the knock of a visitor, nor the scrape of claw or boot. It was a chime small and clear, like a glass bell struck by moonlight. Tomas rose, cat following, and began to descend. Halfway down, on the landing near the wooden shelf, he paused. There, resting once more in the same space where notes had appeared, was a feather. This one was longer than before, white with silver edges, and beneath it, a folded piece of cloth. Tomas picked it up gently. The fabric was soft, woven with a pattern of vines and bells. Inside it was wrapped as stone smooth, cool, and marked with a single rune. He held the stone in his palm for a long time before speaking softly. I understand. No words were written, but none were needed. He returned to the top of the tower, placed the feather gently between 2 pages of his journal, set the stone beside the bell, and wrapped the cloth around the lantern's base. The cat returned to its corner. Tomas sat again, this time with his eyes open and his heart very still. He did not write this time. He only watched. The 10th hour settled over Elmsworth like a velvet curtain being drawn across the world. The stars overhead shimmered with a new steadiness, no longer twinkling but burning slow and sure. It was the hour when even dreams seemed to drift deeper, when sleepers rolled onto their sides, tucked hands beneath cheeks, and gave themselves fully to rest. In the tower, Tomas remained awake, breathing in rhythm with the silence. He sat on the ledge again, this time facing west, where the moon cast its faintest light along the edge of the bell. The stone beneath him was cool, but not unkind. It held warmth from the day, like old memory woven into stone. He traced the line of the feather resting in his journal. Its silver edge caught the light in a way that made it seem almost woven of breath and thread. He had not yet spoken of the stone. He held it earlier, long enough to sense what it carried, but did not write of it. Some things, he believed, were not meant to be recorded. They were meant to be held once like a breath, then let go. That was the difference between watching and keeping. A watcher observes. A keeper holds. Tonight, he was only a watcher. The cat stirred again, and for the first time, climbed into the window ledge beside him. It did not look out. It looked at Tomas, eyes bright, ears still. He looked back, and in that silence, they shared something that needed no naming. Tomas blinked slowly and exhaled. The tower seemed to echo his breath. He stood and moved inside again, lantern in hand, stepping around the great bell with a reverence that had grown over years of quiet. The bell was not an object to him. It was presence, memory, time suspended. He often imagined it contained all the sounds it had ever made, layered one over the other like tree rings of resonance. He sat beside it once more and opened the journal, though he did not write just yet. Instead, he listened. Not for flute or bell or wind, just the deep pulse of the night. The kind that was felt behind the ribs, in the center of the chest, where silence speaks. He finally dipped the pen. 10th hour. The air holds steady. The stone remains silent, but it speaks in shape. The feather watches. The bell remembers. The village sleeps. Outside, the wind had returned, light and cold and soft like silk dragged through snow. It made the archways sing in a way he had only heard a handful of times before, when the wind came from the north during a clear hour of moon. A harmony of stone and air, ancient and hollow, like the echo of a bell heard through water. Tomas rose again, walking slowly to the east-facing ledge. The forest was almost black now, only the faintest silver outlining its shape. But the path was visible, the one he could never quite see during the day. It curled toward the trees and then disappeared into a thick gathering of shadow and fog. But tonight, there was a new detail. A light. A single unmoving light deep within the trees. Not torch. Not flame. Not star. It glowed soft and steady like a lantern left on a windowsill. He stood still for a very long time, watching, listening, feeling the quiet hum behind his eyes. The bell behind him remained still. The cat moved to the opening beside him, sitting calmly at his feet. The two watched the distant glow in silence. And then, without sound or signal, the light dimmed and vanished. Not extinguished, not gone, just no longer needed. Thomas breathed in slowly, then turned back toward the bell. The journal lay open, its pages catching the light. He wrote again. The forest light appeared. It waited, then left. I feel seen. I feel still. He did not feel fear. He felt presence. That same soft awareness that filled the tower itself, that lived in the silence between bell tolls, that wrapped the night like linen around the bones of sleep. He sat again, folded his hands in his lap, and simply existed for a time. Outside, the night rolled on. The stars slowly shifted their positions. The moon dipped lower in the sky, and the watch continued. The 11th hour crept in quietly, like a cat through a curtain. No chimes marked its arrival, no distant bells. Just a feeling in the bones that the night had passed a threshold. Tomas remained by the bell, his posture relaxed, his gaze soft. The cat dozed beside him, its tail twitching gently in some dream Thomas would never know. Outside, the stars gleamed cold and clear, their light steady and thin, like frost caught in the shape of fireflies. He did not move much now. There was no need. At this hour, the world narrowed, not in size but in focus. A single sound might stretch to fill all of thought. A whisper could become an echo. He listened to the lantern's flame as it drew in air, a soft crackle rising and falling in a rhythm like breathing. He rested one hand lightly on the floor beside him, grounding himself to the stone. When he opened the journal, he did not look at the page. He simply moved his pen and let his thoughts flow, more shapes than words. 11th hour. Stillness holds. The bell does not speak, yet I hear it. A hush stretches wide. The village sleeps with softer breath. I write only to remember how silence feels. He closed the book gently and stood. Walking slowly to the western window, he noticed the moon lowering further, casting a longer beam of silver across the rooftops. Each house seemed wrapped in fog now, but not the heavy kind. This was the fog of warmth meeting cold, rising from rooftops like soft smoke after sleep. He imagined the baker stirring, slipping loaves into the deep brick oven, hands dusted with flour. Somewhere, a mother likely turned in bed, reaching to tuck the blanket closer to her child. Thomas leaned against the window arch. The bell loomed behind him like a companion in thought, its shape vast yet comforting. He could sense the change in air, just the slightest shift toward day, not in color or light, but in weight. The night was thinning. He looked toward the path again. It was dark, and the glow from before had not returned, but the memory of it lingered in his chest like an ember. Not burning, but warm. Whatever had been watching, whatever had left that gentle beacon within the trees, had not gone far. Its presence now felt like something standing just out of sight, not in threat, but in understanding. He remained at the window for a long time, watching the sky change by degrees no eye could see, only feel. Slowly he returned to his bench, and the cat leapt lightly into his lap. He whispered, "We're nearly there," and the cat responded only by purring softly and curling tighter. The journal remained closed. Thomas needed no more words. Not yet. He drifted, eyes open but unfocused, breathing slow and deep. He remembered the feather, and the stone, and the cloth with the woven pattern of bells. And somewhere deep in that stillness, a memory not his own came gently into his mind. He saw a tower, much like this one, but older. He saw a young woman standing in a long cloak of pale blue, her hands wrapped around a lantern with a copper frame. Her eyes were closed. Behind her, the bell had just tolled, and around the base of the tower, people stood with candles held high. They did not speak. They only breathed together, in and out, a silent vigil, a remembering. Then the image faded, and Thomas opened his eyes again. He felt no surprise, no confusion, only peace. He had watched the bell long enough to know that memory does not belong only to the mind. Some things settle in stones, in ropes, in the rhythm of hours. Some things pass from watcher to watcher like light passed between cupped hands. And now, the 12th hour approached, the end of the watch, and the beginning of rest. He stood once more, walked the full circle of the bell tower. His footsteps made no sound. The air was warm now, holding the promise of dawn. He lit one final candle and placed it near the eastern archway, where the first light would touch the tower. Then he sat down once more, wrote the final line of his entry, 12th hour. The night has breathed fully. The bell sleeps, and I too will sleep, but I'm not alone. He closed the journal. The cat stretched and leapt to the floor. and the first pink breath of sunrise touched the lip of the bell. The 12th hour had passed, and the light of dawn began to seep into the edges of the sky, pale and cool, like water poured gently over a quiet world. Tomas remained seated, still and silent, letting the warmth of the rising sun find him slowly. The candle he had placed at the eastern archway flickered faintly, its flame now barely visible against the gathering light. It would soon extinguish itself, not out of haste, but because its work was done. The cat, sensing the change in hour, padded to the center of the platform and stretched, its back arching high before settling again on a warm patch of stone. The tower, once filled with the depth and mystery of midnight, now felt lighter, not hollow, but open, as if a breath long held had finally been released. Tomas stood slowly, his limbs carrying the calm weight of night. He stepped to the ledge and looked out across the rooftops. The village of Elmsworth glistened slightly, the dew on every tile and thatch catching the first slants of golden morning. Chimneys began to whisper thin trails of smoke again. A rooster called from somewhere distant. The day had begun, but he had not yet finished. He walked one last circle around the bell, placing a hand on its side as he passed. Its metal was warm now, touched by the sun, and silent in its joy. No need to ring, no need to speak. Some bells simply held space, and that was more than enough. He retrieved the journal, now thick with ink and pressed with feather and cloth, in silence. He turned to the last page and wrote slowly, letting each word rest fully on the paper before the next came. Morning has come. The village wakes. The bell remains, and so does the silence. I was the watcher. I listened. I breathed with the night. And now the tower exhales. He closed the book, stepped to the stairs, and began his descent. Each step downward felt like releasing a thread of dream, gently, as one wakes slowly without alarm. The light grew warmer as he neared the bottom. Dust motes floated in the beams of dawn, slicing through high windows, making the air look golden and thick like honey. When he reached the bottom, he did not leave right away. Instead, he opened the tower's wooden door and stood on the threshold. A woman passed with a basket of herbs. She looked up and smiled at him. No words needed. Children's voices echoed down the lane as they ran toward the bakery. The world was new again. Tomas stepped out and walked along the path that circled the base of the tower. From this angle, it rose like a mountain of memory, its stones old and wise and kind. The bell within would not ring until night returned, and someone, maybe him, maybe another, would climb once more and listen. But for now, his watch was over. The village did not need to know what he had seen. The forest did not need to call again. The bell did not need to speak. Some things, when watched with care, remain whole simply because someone loved them enough to notice. He walked slowly toward home. The cat followed at his heels, and the morning spread like a yawn over the rooftops of Elmsworth. Tomas did not sleep immediately after returning home. His little cottage, nestled beneath the outer edge of the old orchard, still held the hush of night. The walls, made of pale stone and thick timber, seemed to breathe with him. He placed the journal gently on the low table beside his bed and moved through his morning rituals without sound. Tea brewed softly over a low flame. A basin of water, cool and clear, for rinsing his face. A single window, opened just a little, to let the birdsong in. But even as the sun climbed, Tomas's thoughts did not rise with it. They lingered behind, in the tower, with the feather and the bell and the memory of the light in the forest. As he sipped his tea, he stared out the window, watching the apple trees sway gently. The breeze was slow and full of scent blossoms. Bark, damp earth, and somewhere faint, the scent of old parchment, though no books had been opened. By midday, he had laid down to rest. But the sleep that came to him was not like the deep slumber of exhaustion. It was the kind of sleep one drifts into gently, like sinking into warm water, eyes open one moment and closed the next. And within it, dreams came. Not just dreams, but visitations. In the dream, he was once again in the tower. But it was not his tower. The walls were smoother, the stone brighter, and the bell was smaller, older, darker in tone. It rang with a hum so low, it trembled through his ribs. Across from him stood a child, cloaked in silver, holding the same feather he had found. The child did not speak, but when they extended their hand, Thomas took it. Together, they walked down to the tower, not downstairs, but through the wall itself, into a long field filled with stars. Not above them, but underfoot. The stars shimmered beneath translucent grass, glowing faintly with each step they took. The dream shifted. He now stood in the heart of the forest, where the light had once appeared. But instead of shadow and bramble, the space was open, filled with bellflowers blooming in midnight blue. In the center stood a small table, on it a journal bound in silver thread. When Tomas reached out to touch it, the pages fluttered open by themselves, revealing a single phrase written again and again in quiet, elegant script. The watchers remember. The bells do not forget. He woke with a slow inhale, sunlight pooling across his blanket. The room was warm, the kettle still warm to the touch, and outside, the orchard buzzed softly with bees. But the dream had not faded. It lingered with clarity that only truth can hold. He stood, dressed, and returned to the tower. The path was familiar, the turns memorized, the sky now streaked with golden clouds preparing for dusk. Each step toward the tower felt charged, not with urgency, but with certainty. Something had begun. Inside the tower, everything was just as he left it. The lantern, the bench, the bell, but the air had changed. There was a sense of waiting, not tense, not impatient, but alive. He moved slowly, reverently, and as he reached the top, he noticed something new. A second feather. It lay atop the bell itself. This one was black, with a single silver thread running along its spine. He took it gently, fingers brushing the metal, and placed it beside the first in his journal. And this time, he wrote. Afternoon return. A second feather. The bell remained still. I dreamed a forest of stars, and the child knew the bell's name. He closed the journal but did not leave. Instead, he sat once more beside the archway and looked out across the village. He could feel it now change. Not danger, not loss, but a cycle closing, and something else beginning. A transition, like dusk turning to night, not suddenly, but softly, as if the world was exhaling into a deeper truth. The cat returned again, this time with a small scrap of cloth in its mouth. Tomas took it and unfolded the fabric. On it, stitched in red thread, was a small symbol. A circle, a bell, and a tree. His hand trembled not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen it before, in the dream, in the forest, in the stars beneath the grass. He knew now what he had to do. Not today, not even tonight, but soon, he would leave the tower and walk into the woods, not to escape, but to return. He sat back and whispered to the wind, I am listening. The bell, though silent, echoed softly in his chest. The next morning arrived in silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the deep, golden stillness that lives in the heart of early light. Tomas awoke before the sun had crested the hills, his body knowing something his mind had not yet spoken. He dressed in quiet layers, wrapped a soft scarf around his neck, and gathered 3 things into a satchel: the journal, both feathers, and the room-marked stone. He did not carry the bell's rope. That belonged to the tower. He stepped outside into the crisp air and walked toward the woods. Not quickly, not slowly, just steady, as though his feet remembered the way before he could name it. The village still slept, though a few lanterns flickered behind drawn curtains. The hawthorn tree near the square was beginning to blush with green again. Its blossoms fluttered as Tomas passed, and a single petal landed gently on his shoulder. He let it stay. The path beyond the mill curved gently eastward, then narrowed beneath the arching canopy of the elder trees. Here, the sound of the village faded, replaced by bird calls and the distant creak of trees shifting in their roots. Tomas inhaled deeply and stepped beyond the final gate. The forest welcomed him. The trees whispered as he walked, their leaves trembling softly in the breeze. Light filtered down in golden strands, like thread weaving between branches. Every now and then, he paused not from tiredness, but reverence. The forest was old, older than the tower, older than the bell. It did not forget. After nearly an hour, he arrived at the clearing. It was exactly as it had been in his dream. The bellflowers bloomed in rich midnight blue, their petals swaying like breath. And in the center stood the small stone table. Upon it sat the journal from his vision bound in silver thread, its pages fluttering softly, though there was no wind. And there, standing beside it, was the child in the silver cloak. They turned, looked at him, and smiled not with their mouth, but with their entire presence. Tomas stepped forward. He placed his journal on the table, the feathers beside it, and the stone atop the cloth. The child reached out and touched each item once. Then they whispered, voice as light as dusk, "You are not the first, and you will not be the last. The watchers come when the bell forgets, and the bell remembers when the watcher dreams." Tomas bowed his head. He did not need answers, only understanding. The child opened the silver-threaded book and placed Tomas's journal inside it. The covers merged. No seam remained. Then the child faded, not disappeared, but softened into light, like a star sinking into dawn. The clearing remained, still, bright. Tomas stood for a while, breathing deeply, until he knew it was time to return. He walked back the way he came, slower now, each footstep a parting kiss upon the moss and stone. When he stepped from the trees and saw the bell tower in the distance, it felt different. Not smaller, not older, just full, as though it carried more now, not in weight, but in memory. That night, he returned once more to the top of the tower, not to watch, but to sit, to listen. And when the bell finally rang, it did not echo through the stone. It rang in his chest, soft and deep, like a heart remembering how to beat. He closed his eyes and smiled. The watch continued, but it no longer belonged to him alone. Days passed quietly after Tomas's return from the forest. The tower stood as it always had, tall and weathered, casting its familiar shadow across the northern fields. Yet everything within it and within Tomas had shifted in ways no eye could measure. He resumed his nightly watches, not out of duty now, but devotion. The bell had not rung since the morning of the clearing, but he felt it still. Not as sound, but as presence. A heartbeat he no longer needed to hear to feel. Word spread gently through Elmsworth. Not spoken aloud in the streets, but carried in the way people moved more slowly, more carefully, as if they, too, could sense a new stillness in the air. Some villagers, who had never glanced twice at the tower, now found themselves pausing beneath it, fingers brushing the moss at its base or resting their gaze on its highest window. Children began placing wildflowers along its stones, as though the tower were a resting place for unseen travelers. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and washed the world in copper and rose, Tomas was visited by an old woman from the village. She wore a cloak stitched with tiny spirals and carried a woven pouch shaped like a bell. "I heard it ring the morning you returned," she said softly. "Not with my ears, but here." She placed her hand over her heart, and I remembered something I had forgotten for many, many years. Tomas invited her up to the top of the tower. Her steps were slow but steady. At the top, she touched the edge of the bell with reverence and wept without sound. "This tower," she whispered, "used to be one of many. A circle. A sound wheel, they called it. Each tower watched a direction. Each bell a guardian. You have restored more than you know." That night, Thomas sat long after she had gone, lantern dimmed low, journal unopened. The wind curled in through the arches, wrapping around him like an old friend. He leaned against the bell and listened not for answers, but for memory. And in that stillness, the bell began to hum. Not aloud, inside. It was faint at first, like the echo of a lullaby you once knew, sung through water, drifting from a far shore. But it grew steadily, a resonance not of metal, but of meaning. Tomas placed his hand on the side of the bell and felt it pulsing gently, like breath. The next morning, the village awoke to find thin strands of silver mist curling from the tower's windows. Not smoke, not fog, but something older. It smelled faintly of thyme and linen, of ink and midnight. The mist didn't fall to the ground. It hung in the air like ribbon, shifting gently in invisible currents, before fading with the morning light. Curious, the children of Elmsworth stood in a ring around the base, whispering to one another. One brave boy stepped forward and placed a small toy horse carved from wood on the tower steps. He didn't know why, only that it felt right. The next night, he dreamed of standing atop the tower, watching the stars flow like rivers. When he woke, he told his parents the bell had spoken to him in the dream. It had said, "You will remember what others forget." As the days unfolded, Tomas began to notice subtle changes. The journal no longer responded only to his pen. Words appeared overnight, written in fine hand, unshakably old. Sometimes a single line, "The Western Watch remains," or "Stone remembers song." Once, a longer entry appeared, 4 full pages, penned in a spiral, so that Tomas had to turn the book slowly to read it. It spoke of the original circle of towers, of how each watcher once held a piece of something called the silence thread. It was not a rope or fabric, but a woven knowing, a connection that tied watcher to bell, bell to earth, earth to sky. Elmsworth, the entry said, had once been known as Lowbell's Edge. It was the last of the circle, the last bell still standing, the final watcher. And now, the first to awaken. Tomas closed the journal that night and held it to his chest. He did not sleep. He simply listened. It was the 4th night after the silver mist first curled through the tower windows when Tomas awoke from a soft dream, not with fear, but with clarity. The bell had not spoken aloud, but he had felt something shift again, as though the stars themselves had turned a page. He dressed slowly in heavier robes, now the autumn chill beginning to settle in the bones of the village, and made his way up the tower with the ease of one who had memorized every groove and creak of the stone beneath his feet. The lantern in the corner flickered to life with a single breath. He no longer needed flint or spark to summon its flame. It simply knew. The bell, quiet and calm, shimmered faintly in the firelight. Tomas took his place on the wooden bench by the eastern window and opened the journal, half expecting another mysterious entry. But this time, the pages remained blank. Instead, he felt a warmth settle in the room, and when he looked toward the window, he saw someone he hadn't seen in nearly a decade. It was Lior, a fellow apprentice from the old scriptorium in the southern province. Once a dreamer, always a wanderer. He stood at the arch, his form half solid, half light, dressed in deep green, with parchment peeking from his satchel. Tomas rose, breath caught in reverence, but he didn't speak. Neither did Lior. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of stories, of paths taken and lost, of nights under stars with ink-stained fingers and fire-warmed laughter. Lior stepped inside and placed a small vial on the journal. It shimmered with faint gold inside, like liquid candlelight. Then he bowed his head and vanished. Tomas stared at the vial. He knew what it was. Memory ink. A rare creation, one the old scribes swore could only be brewed during eclipses, and only by those who would have loss in one hand and hope in the other. With it, one could write the truth of dreams, the ones too real to speak and too fragile to forget. He opened to the back of the journal and dipped his quill. He began to write, slowly, letting the ink flow in curves and arcs across the page. As he did, the candlelight in the room grew brighter, the air thicker, humming with quiet energy. He wrote of the forest clearing, of the silver-threaded book, of the child with no name, of the bell's heartbeat and the dreams of starlit fields, of watchers long forgotten and bells never meant to toll in war. And as he wrote, the bell chimed once, soft, just once. And yet the sound echoed through the entire village, not as noise, but as awareness. Babies stirred gently in their cradles and smiled. Elders awoke with tearful eyes, remembering names they thought lost. Farmers paused in their evening work and looked east without knowing why. And deep in the woods, creatures stilled and listened. That night, the journal closed itself. And from that moment on, Tomas was no longer the only watcher. Others came. Quietly at first, a weaver named Bryn, who would always hum to herself when working, claiming she sometimes heard bells in the thread. A baker's daughter who sketched towers in flour dust without knowing their names. An old gardener who never spoke but left carved stones at the tower base with ancient symbols. They didn't need to be told what to do. They simply knew. Each took turns ascending the tower at twilight. And though the bell never rang with metal's voice, it welcomed them. Each time, the lantern would light on its own. And each time, the journal would open to a fresh page, sometimes revealing words that had not been written yet. It was no longer a watch. It was a remembering. Tomas now shared the silence with others, and in doing so, the silence deepened. It expanded not as void, but as presence. The villagers began to notice small changes, dreams becoming clearer, plants growing in quiet corners where no seeds had been placed, a warmth in the bell tower shadow even during frost. And once, when a traveler arrived from a distant coast and climbed the tower with reverence, he wept before the bell and spoke only one phrase. I thought they were all gone. He stayed 3 nights in Elmsworth and then left without a word. But he left behind a shard of crystal wrapped in wool. Tomas placed it beneath the bell. It pulsed gently with light. More tokens came. A seashell etched with spiral runes. A dried petal sealed in glass. A piece of parchment with a lullaby written in a forgotten tongue. Each object carried its own silence, its own weightless message. And the tower held them all. It did not display them. It absorbed them. Night by night, season by season, the watchers grew, not in number, but in knowing. They did not speak often of the bell. It didn't need discussion. It was part of them now, like breath, like heartbeat, like dusk. And one day, just as the first snow of winter kissed the grass with silver, Tomas passed the bell rope to a young boy with wide eyes and steady hands. The boy did not pull it. He simply held it and smiled. Tomas nodded and descended the tower, this time not as a watcher leaving a shift, but as one returning to earth his part fulfilled. He walked through the snow-dusted orchard and sat beside the old hawthorn tree, now bare and beautiful. The sky above stretched pale and blue, like silk left out in the cold. He looked at his hands. They trembled slightly, not from age, but from release. The bell had remembered. The silence had returned. The watchers were many, and the dream was only beginning. The snow grew deeper in the weeks that followed, blanketing Elmsworth in silence more profound than the bell itself. And yet, the silence felt heavier than peace. Something was changing again, whispers moving not just in dreams, but through the waking air. The watchers felt it first. Some returned from the tower pale and trembling, unable to speak for hours. One girl came down with blood on her fingertips, though she'd touched nothing. Another spoke of the watcher before the watcher, and would not sleep indoors again. Tomas knew the signs. He had read of them once in the lost pages of the Southern records, a time when the bell woke not only to remember, but to reckon. The bells, it was said, had once been guardians, but also judges. And when memory was twisted or betrayed, the bells turned harsh. Sound could be soothing, but it could also be a blade. It began with the trees. The orchard nearest the tower blackened at the tips of each branch, not from frost. The bark split with a sound like cracking bone, and from within dripped not sap, but ink-dark resin, thick and bitter. The hawthorn tree near the village well, the same tree where Tomas had once sat in peace, withered in a single night. All that remained was a hollow stump, inside of which a crow had left a bundle of human hair tied with red string. The village grew quiet, not peaceful quiet, fearful. Old symbols began to appear, etched beneath windowsills and scratched into the wooden beams of the tavern. Protective signs. Desperate hands had carved them. Parents no longer let their children approach the tower. Even the cats avoided the base of the stones. But Tomas stayed. He did more than stay. He watched. And in the third week of silence, the bell tolled, once loud. It shook the tower. It shook the fields. It split the earth beside the mill by exactly 7 inches. The sound carried past the hills and into the woods, and something answered. A howl not of beast, not of wind, but of something between. The next day, a farmer found a deer near the outer field, lying motionless with eyes wide open. No wounds, no blood, just silence. The entire herd vanished by evening. The watchers were shaken. Bryn, the weaver, stood atop the tower that night and looked toward Tomas with trembling lips. "Something is coming," she said. "And it is not here to be remembered." Tomas nodded. He now understood what he had read between the lines of the journal. The bell tower was not merely a memory keeper. It was a sentinel, and its chime was a warning. He returned to the tower the following dawn, this time not with ink and quill, but with fire salts and the ceremonial veil. These were ancient tools, kept sealed beneath the tower stones, only for grave need, only when the watcher had to bind the forgotten. He lit 4 braziers, one at each corner of the bell's base, and sprinkled the salts in a circle. The flames turned green. The journal opened on its own. The pages filled, one by one. Not with words, with symbols and blood. Old blood. Faded but fresh enough to pulse beneath the vellum. He whispered the ancient words, not to summon, but to seal. And the bell screamed. It rang not with sound, but with violence. Glass shattered in the village square. Milk curdled in cellars. A horse dropped mid-gallop, eyes rolling white. The tower trembled, and Tomas fell to his knees. But he did not break. The watchers gathered below, faces upturned, pale in the firelight spilling from the tower. Bryn wept openly. The old gardener, silent as always, held a shard of mirror to the moon and whispered, "It has tasted the forgetting." And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The bell fell silent. The flames died. The journal closed. And something inside the tower exhaled for the first time in centuries. Tomas rose, eyes wide, and looked at the bell. A crack had formed down its side, fine as hair, deep as history. But it did not collapse. It simply glowed faintly, with threads of starlight running through the fracture. And in that moment, Tomas understood. The bell had judged. But it had chosen mercy. Not all memory needed to be punished. Some needed only to be held, seen, and finally let go. That night, Elmsworth slept as it had not in months. Not in fear, but in mourning. Not for a person, but for a past that had finally been set down. The watchers lit a single candle in each window, and the bell tower stood not triumphant but quiet, soft, and just a little broken. Just like them. The thaw came early that year, not with rains or sudden warmth, but with silence. Deep, encompassing silence. A hush so total that the wind itself seemed to pause in reverence. In the village of Elmsworth, no one spoke of the bell anymore, but all eyes were drawn to the tower, and all footsteps unconsciously slowed as they passed it. The crack down the bell side had not widened. It had become a mark, not of damage, but of memory etched like a scar on something ancient and beloved. Tomas did not return to the tower as a watcher anymore. He came only to sit at its base, in the pale grass just now pushing up through the frost. He would close his eyes and listen not for sound, but for feeling. And more often than not, he would weep. Not from sorrow, but from release. The burden was lifting. He was no longer alone. Other villages sent messengers. Quiet, wide-eyed individuals, many of whom arrived under dream's compulsion or inexplicable pull. They did not know why they had come, only that they must. Some brought tokens, more fragments of bone, old music boxes that played only once, scrolls with ink that moved when you stared too long. Elmsworth became a center of stillness, a place remembered not for battles or kings, but for silence that had changed the world. But the silence was not complete. One morning, under a sky so blue it looked painted, the bell rang again. Not loud, not angry. A single aching tone, slow, drawn, and full of sorrow. It echoed like a farewell. Tomas, now grayer, stood by the base of the tower as the watchers gathered. He did not speak. He simply placed his hand to the stone, then turned away and walked toward the forest path. He did not return. Some said he vanished into mist. Others claimed he became part of the bell itself, that when the light strikes the crack just right, you can see his silhouette moving inside the metal. But the watchers knew the truth. He had joined the memory, and the bell had let him go. After Tomas's passing, the tower became more alive than ever. The journal, once the tool of one watcher, became a living artifact. It flipped its own pages now, offering blank spaces to new hands. Some wrote dreams, others drew. A few wrote music, scores in ink that shimmered gold. The children of Elmsworth began to treat the tower like a sacred playground. They played games at its base, danced in its shadow, and once a year held a silent feast in honor of those who kept the watch. They lit no candles. They brought no food. They simply sat in silence, hand in hand, as the stars bloomed above. It was during one of these feasts that the bell gave its final gift. It sang, not a toll, not a warning, a song. It poured gently down the tower like wind made of light, vibrating in the air, soft enough to miss if you weren't listening, but deep enough to echo in bone. It carried no words, only truth. And in that moment, all who sat in its shadow felt something unlock inside them. Some cried, others laughed. A few simply breathed. That song never came again. It didn't need to. From then on, the bell tower was more than stone and metal. It was a vessel of sleep and memory, a place where the forgotten found peace. The forest around Elmsworth grew more wild, more ancient. New paths formed, ones not mapped by man. Some led to nowhere, some to other towers, half standing, half imagined. And in time, stories arose of other watchers waking. Other bells, once shattered, humming faintly in caves, in ruins, in wells. And so the circle slowly began to reform. Not in war, not in power, but in stillness. And when travelers came, pilgrims, dreamers, those who could not remember what they were seeking, they were always welcomed. No one asked their names. No one needed to. They came, they sat by the tower, and they listened. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a lifetime. And when they left lighter. Some said the bell cured them. Others believed the bell whispered their truest name. But all agreed on one thing. You do not forget the tower, even in dreams, especially in dreams. And so, as you rest now in the softness of your blankets, in the hush of your room, let the bell ring inside you once more. Not with sound, but with stillness, with remembering, with peace. Close your eyes. The watch is kept. You may drift. You may dream. The bell tower watches still. The days grew longer after the bell sang, but not brighter. There was a pale hue to the sun now, like a candle hidden behind parchment. And though no hand turned it, new lines would appear sometimes just before dusk, sometimes between dreams. No one could say who wrote them. Some believed it was Tomas, still watching from beyond. Others thought it was the bell itself, remembering what even memory had forgotten. In Elmsworth, the people no longer feared the tower, yet they approached it with the reverence of old temples, speaking softly in its shadow, walking barefoot on the grass beneath its eastern face. No one ever saw her clearly, only her shadow moving along the stone wall just as the sun began to fall. He carried nothing but a pebble, the color of old bone, and a single phrase. They said she left behind small offerings, feathers dipped in ash, black thread woven into spiral knots, and once, a tooth no bigger than a thimble carved with a symbol no one could read. In charcoal, heavy, grainy strokes, like someone pressing too hard against the page. The word spoke of a second bell one buried long ago in the forest's heart, encased in roots, bound with iron and silence. Not with panic, but with a kind of old sorrow like the kind you feel watching autumn leaves fall, knowing you cannot stop them. The journal remained open now, pages fluttering only when the wind carried meaning. Some feared awakening something meant to sleep forever. Others felt called, not in thought, but in dream. Visions of trees with eyes, of a bell made not of metal but of bone, whispering beneath the soil. The children of the village began to speak of a name, a girl with braids of silver who wandered the edge of the woods. They carried no weapons. Only lanterns filled with bellfire, a pale blue flame drawn from the tower's lantern, known to flicker when truth drew near. One child, called Emmerich, followed her shadow once. He did not return that evening. The villagers waited. He returned 3 days later, barefoot, with dirt beneath his fingernails and moss in his hair. "She watches too." That was all he would say for weeks. In its center stood a tree black as soot, wide as a cottage, its bark twisted with veins of silver. At its base was a circle of silence. The lanterns dimmed. Its surface shimmered like bone polished by years of breath. Along its rim were carvings, eyes, teeth, keys, and spirals that seemed to move when stared at too long. But the journal began to write again. This time, not in ink. It was older, darker, and it had not yet rung. The watchers, now numbering 13, debated the truth of the journal. Bryn was the first to volunteer. "We must know," she said, voice even but eyes wide. "What good is memory without its shadow?" So they prepared. 4 watchers, clad in robes of deep green and black, each bearing a token of their own lineage, stepped into the woods at dawn. The forest welcomed them. Too easily, no birds called, no branches snapped. The path bent before them as though already known. They walked for 7 hours, and on the 7th, they found the hollow. A basin in the forest floor, round as a bowl, lined with stones carved in curling runes. The watchers stepped closer. There, half buried, was the second bell. It was smaller, no taller than a man's waist, but it pulsed with something heavier than metal. Bryn reached out a hand. The bell did not toll, it whispered, and each of them heard something different. A name they had forgotten, a place they had never seen, a moment they had never lived. The bell offered memory not from the past, but from possibility. Bryn's lantern died. The others stepped back. And just like that, the forest closed around them. They returned to Elmsworth at dusk silent, trembling, with a new heaviness in their eyes. They would not speak of what they saw. But that night, each watcher carved a new symbol into the tower wall. Not in reverence, in mourning. And above them, the bell remained still. Yet the wind had changed. Winter returned to Elmsworth not with snow, but with fog. Dense and pale, it rolled in from the western hills, curling through windows, slipping beneath doors, wrapping the village in layers of soft hush. Nothing was sharp. Edges blurred. Sound dulled. People moved slower, speaking in whispers, even in their own homes. Not in nonsense, but in fragments of old language runes that hadn't been taught in generations. Some dreamed of long staircases winding into the earth, others of a tower inverted, its bell hanging below the ground, tolling into the roots of the world. The fog had a scent sweet and distant, like the pages of old books left closed too long. And with it came the dreams. All over the village, people began to speak in their sleep. Bryn did not speak. She barely slept. She sat, night after night, at the top of the tower beside the cracked bell, hands folded, eyes watching the horizon as if something might arrive any moment. But by dawn, the bell's lantern had gone out, and on the stone where she once sat was a single feather silver and ash, bound with black thread. Sometimes she hummed not a song exactly, but a cadence, soft and spiraling, echoing gently against the tower walls. Then, one night she vanished. No one heard her leave. No one saw her step down the stairs. The journal wrote that morning. A single line. Where one watcher falls, another must rise. But no one stepped forward. Not yet. The days grew quieter still. And then, strange footprints began to appear near the village edge. Not human, not animal. Long, narrow impressions, with toes that curled slightly inwards. They didn't know why. They just knew it helped. No one saw them form, but each morning, they were there leading from the forest toward the bell tower and stopping just short of its stone base. On the third day, the footprints circled the tower once. She lived on roots, mushrooms, spring water, and the occasional pinch of salt. Another began carving spirals into the trees. A third painted their eyelids black and claimed the dreams were clearer that way. On the fourth, a message appeared beside them, scratched in frost on the stone. Not all memories sleep. The message faded with the morning sun. His mother found his blanket folded neatly on his bed. His shoes were gone. On the pillow was a single strand of his hair, tied with a red thread. It no longer felt like weather. It felt like presence, like something watching, waiting, remembering them in return. The fog grew thicker. Thomas had once called it the memory mist, and now the villagers began using the name too. Children began placing small offerings outside their doors, bits of string, flower petals, flat stones warmed in their pockets. And still, the second bell remained untouched. The four who had found it would not speak of it again, but they changed. One of them, a tall woman named Marn, stopped eating anything grown above the earth. Only one, the youngest, left the village entirely. She walked west into the fog and did not look back. Weeks passed, and then a child went missing. A boy named Kevin, quiet and curious, who had once traced the entire bell tower in chalk and declared it a song made out of stone. The village searched. They found no trail, but behind the tower, beneath a stone that hadn't moved in generations, they found something else. A key, old iron rod, its teeth jagged and irregular, shaped like a flame. Wrapped around it was a note. The ink that filled the page was not black, but red, and it pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. The text was written in two hands, one sharp and precise, the other wild and uneven. 3 words. You remembered me. That night, the bell rang again. Not loud, not harsh, but low and steady, like a breath held too long, finally released. The sound passed through the village like water. People stopped where they stood. They listened. Some cried. Some simply fell asleep, standing where they were, dreams spilling down their cheeks like tears. And when the bell went silent again, the journal opened on its own. Its pages turned faster than ever before, flipping with invisible wind until stopping near the center. One wrote the past, the other wrote the future, and in between was a question, etched deeper than the rest. When the bell tolls inward, will you answer? The watchers gathered. Only 7 remained, and they knew something was rising, not from the tower, but from below. After the bell's inward toll, Elmsworth no longer felt like a village. It felt like a memory, not of one place or one moment, but of hundreds layered upon one another, like thin sheets of light pressing down through fog. The bell, it seemed, was no longer just a keeper of memory. It was becoming a bridge between what was, what is, and what might have been. The villagers moved through days that felt touched by other times. Doors opened to reveal not kitchens, but candlelit corridors. Where once it wrote in neat script or charcoal, now the pages bled faint watercolor images, dreamlike scenes that faded at the edges. A woman in crimson robes, standing atop a field of sleeping wolves. But sounds the quiet rhythm of breathing, the hush of cloth against stone, the rustle of parchment turning in a room with no wind. The village held its breath. The air felt like the pause before something ancient stirred. It had not been entered in generations. Thomas had once sealed it, claiming no purpose lay down there anymore. But now the seal was cracked. A single line of frost trailed down the door, a staircase curling around a sunless void. A child wearing a mask made of bell metal, holding a lantern full of ocean water. Damp. The scent of soil and candle smoke filled their lungs. The villagers stopped trying to understand the symbols. They simply watched. Reflections in windows sometimes showed rooms long gone, chambers with tapestries, iron sconces, and the flicker of unseen hearths, carved not by hands but grown, as though the stone itself had formed steps in obedience to something below. At first, the people feared madness. Then, they began to accept it, not as illness, but as unfolding, from remembering things they had never lived. A city of bells that sang the weather into shape. A woman who kept the moon in the lantern. A boy who could walk through dreams and never wake. Another held the old journal pressed to their chest. They passed under arches that shimmered with slow-moving like runes that faded as they approached, as if embarrassed to be seen. Cloaked in moss, veiled in vines, eyes closed but seeing, the journal changed again. One evening, as the fog lifted for the first time in days, a stranger arrived. In the center, a well of black water, still as stone. And beside it, half buried in roots and moss, stood a pedestal. On it, a bell, small, cracked, but humming. Its tone was not heard, but felt in the chest, in the teeth, behind the eyes. He came from the northern pass, cloaked in stitched hides, his boots laced with braided grass. He carried no pack, no food, only a carved walking stick topped with a bell-shaped stone. His eyes were milky white blind, but he moved as if he saw more than anyone else. He said nothing for 3 days. He merely sat beside the tower, hands folded in his lap, listening. On the 4th night, he spoke just once. They'd buried the 3rd bell beneath the dreaming roots. Then he fell silent forever. He died that same night, peacefully, leaning against the tower with a faint smile. In his pocket, the villagers found a piece of torn parchment. It held a drawing, not of a bell, but of something beneath one. A skeleton coiled in sleep, fused with the roots of a great tree, its ribcage strung with silver threads like strings of a harp. No one knew what it meant, but everyone felt its weight. The fog returned the next morning, and this time it whispered. Not words, not names. Then came the sound of footsteps. Not near the tower, beneath it. The watchers, now 6 in number, descended the inner stairwell past the bell, past the records chamber, into the crypt beneath. When they opened it, they found not bones or dust. They found stairs, endless, spiraling downward. The watchers descended. One carried a lantern. The air grew warmer. After what felt like hours, they arrived in the chamber, circular, vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. The watchers approached. One knelt and placed the journal beside the pedestal. The pages turned. The bell pulsed. And then the chamber sang, not aloud, but within them. Each of the 6 watchers fell to their knees, eyes wide, weeping not from fear, but from knowing. They saw lives, countless, endless, and all of them led here, to this moment, to this bell, to this breath. Then the water stirred, slowly, and from beneath its black surface rose a shape. It was not a creature, not a ghost. It was memory made form. It opened its mouth, and the bell tolled, soft and absolute. The watchers did not flee. They wept, because they knew this was not the end. This was the remembering. The remembering did not end when the bell tolled. In the days that followed, The villagers of Elmsworth began to feel a shift subtle, like waking from a dream not quite ready to release you. People paused more often, gazing into corners as if expecting a figure to emerge. Children laughed without understanding why, their games more playful, their songs filled with ancient rhythms they had never learned. They brought small offerings, bundles of wild herbs, folded pages of forgotten names, shards of mirror glass to reflect the chamber's unseen light. And each time they came, the bell at the pedestal gave a single quiet breath of sound. The bell tower's walls, once cracked and chipped, began to shift very slowly, smoothing over in places, as though the stone remembered its younger form. Not music, not a toll, just presence, a note without end. The fog began to thin, but it did not disappear. It remained lighter now, curling around windows and treetops like a soft shawl. The villagers no longer feared it. They welcomed it, knowing it carried echoes, like whispers of a place that remembered them in return. In the crypt, the watchers returned daily. They rose slowly, drawn to the tower, not by duty, but by instinct. One watcher, the youngest now, began to keep the new journal. Its pages were different, thicker, slightly warm to the touch. She wrote not in sentences, but in impressions. The earth beneath me today. In that moment, she understood. I saw a blue light blink 3 times before fading into the roots. Her silver-braided hair shimmered like moonlight, and her eyes held the weight of 1,000 dreams. She said nothing, but in her hand she carried a feather black with its tip dipped in white ash. She handed it to Mar without a word, then walked into the mist and vanished. No one spoke. A quiet ritual formed, shaped by memory and silence. One by one, they laid small tokens at the tower's footseats, threads, notes, feathers. No one said why. No one needed to. My aim feels different when I say it aloud here. Above ground, the village blossomed in quiet ways. The garden near the bell tower grew taller than ever, sprouting strange vines with white flowers that only opened after dusk. One morning, the tower's great bell rang again. Laughter in forgotten languages, wind across ancient fields, footsteps in corridors carved from sleep, bells ringing in places no longer marked on maps. And those who had once visited the tower often returned in dreams, finding its steps beneath their feet without walking, hearing its hum inside their bones. Just once. No wind moved. No hand touched it. But the sound pulsed through the village like a heartbeat, stirring those who still slept. At its base, they found a stranger, a girl, barefoot. Mar held the feather to her chest. The circle was whole again. Where Tomas had once kept the watch alone, now many kept it. Where the bell had tolled in warning, now it tolled in remembrance. Where the forest had hidden its deeper roots, now it invited only those ready to listen. That night, the villagers gathered beneath the stars, and high above, the bell remained still. but the stillness itself felt alive. Some nights, if one sat very still beside the base of the tower and closed their eyes, they could hear it, not the bell, but the dreams held inside it. It was said the bell tower watched not just Elmsworth, but all places like it, villages half lost to time, crossroads where memory pooled, ruins where sleep came easier than waking. The watchers no longer feared what lay beneath. They came to understand. The bell tower did not guard the past. It cradled the possibility of remembering, deep, eternal, and kind. And so, as the seasons passed, and the mist thinned, and time moved on in its quiet way, the people of Elmsworth slept more peacefully than ever before, because they knew the bell would always be there, watching, holding, waiting only for the soft breath of memory to rise again. The year turned quietly in Elmsworth. Snow came in soft flurries, settling over rooftops and paths like forgotten pages. The bell tower stood wrapped in white, its stone warmed from within by a flame no one fed. Beneath it, the watchers moved in silence, their lanterns dim but steady, their eyes no longer searching but waiting. Mar, now the quiet keeper of the journal, continued her gentle recording. She wrote not for answers, but to hold moments still. One entry read, "I saw a shadow smile today." Another simply said, "The tower sighed. It was not sad." The villagers had begun a custom something that started without words. At dusk, just before sleep, they stepped outside their homes, turned toward the tower, and whispered a name. Not their own. Not anyone they knew. And from deep, deep below, Mar heard the toll of the third bell. Not a warning, not a remembering, but an arrival. The opening closed behind them, not with bark, but with silence. Mar returned to Elmsworth with the thimble bell cradled in cloth. She placed it in the center of the tower's floor. No one touched it after. They didn't need to. Its presence was enough. That night, a single raven landed on the lantern perch, looked directly through the window of the bell chamber, and let out one quiet sound. Not a caw, a hum, low and echoing. Then it flew off toward the woods. People dreamed not just of the past, but of other villages, other towers, other bells. And in those dreams, watchers stood just like them, gentle, waiting, listening. The people of Elmsworth began to understand. The bell tower was not the only one. There were others, all connected, all waking. And the third bell, small and delicate, was the key between them. Just a name that came to them, carried up from dreams or deep places within. Just trust. The kind that grows when you've walked through dreams and returned. It had never burned, but it carried warmth like breath. At its base was a child, not sleeping, not awake. Eyes closed, hands folded around a bell no bigger than a thimble. She passed a field, now soft with snow, and entered the edge of the forest, where old watchers once found the second bell. But the raven did not turn there. It led her farther, past frozen creeks and stones carved with spiral runes, until she reached the hollow tree. No one knew what it meant. But after, they always slept deeper. On the 12th evening of the new moon, something shifted. It began with the birds. For months, none had flown near the tower, and in that instant, the forest fell silent. Every branch, every breeze, still. Then came a sound, a single whispered chime from the tiny bell, not loud, but eternal. Mar followed, not with fear, not even with urgency. The tree was unlike the others, twisted like a dancer paused in motion, hollowed through by time, yet pulsing faintly with heat. Mar knelt. The child opened their eyes, pale gold, familiar and strange. Without speaking, they held out the bell. Mar took it. The snow beneath her feet softened. The roots of the hollow tree quivered. The ground beneath her seemed to breathe. The child stood and walked into the hollow tree without looking back. Over the weeks that followed, the dreams changed. They became clearer, brighter. With the third bell resting within the tower, Elmsworth grew even quieter, not in silence, but in presence. Every sound felt intentional, the crunch of footsteps in frost, the hush of a sleeve brushing a doorway, the distant toll of metal on memory. The journal sat open now, no longer needing to be written by hand. Words simply appeared each morning, fresh ink forming as though whispered into the page by unseen voices. Dreams remembered are seeds. Do not fear the root. Each bell is a breath of time. Her voice had joined the others, those that lived beneath the bells, within the stone, around the dreams. But now she spoke once more, and only one word, open. The people stopped asking questions. They simply became part of the rhythm, a gentle corridor of humming quiet, shadows that glowed, light that did not hurt the eyes, and far ahead, no urgency, no fear. With every step, their thoughts became lighter. Memories once burdened now felt like feathers. And then they reached the center. The echo of Bellsoft, patient, layered like a song passed down in whispers. They descended once more into the crypt, lantern steady, breath even. Not built, formed, of memory, mist, and intention. And there, where once the pedestal stood alone, now rose a new doorway. It turned slowly, its surface shifting between reflections, each one a face, a tower, a dream. Mar reached toward it, and the bell, for the first time, chose to speak. Not in words, but in knowing. It offered no instruction, only the invitation to remember. Not just what was, but what could be, if remembered with kindness. Its arch glowed with quiet light, pulsing in time with their heartbeats. And as the bell tolled once more, this time in complete silence, the light of the space flickered like a deep exhale. They closed their eyes and awoke, not in the crypt, not in Elmsworth, but in other towers, other lives, each in a different place, each now a seed, a new watch, a new beginning. The door itself was not solid, but soft like silk, rippling with each breath. And so the story drifts not into ending, but into rest. Silent, glowing, waiting for the next dream to find its way home. The bells will always be there, not loud, not demanding, just waiting, watching, holding, guiding you home to sleep. On its surface was a map, not of roads or mountains, but of connections. Between towers, between people, between the moments when one truly listens. They planted gardens according to what the mist revealed in their sleep. The tower did not demand attention. It invited awareness. They sang lullabies not learned from their parents, but from the echoes of older villages far beyond the mountains. The lines between waking and sleeping grew soft, like fog blurring the edge of a lake. The watchers no longer kept shifts. There was no need. It was not of this season or this world. Its petals were translucent, humming faintly with soundless vibration. It did not wilt. It did not need sun or water. It simply was. One morning, in the tower's highest window, where once a raven perched, a flower unfurled. A signal, a sign. That something was ready. The people began to live in harmony with the dreams. And then, something unexpected bloomed. Mar stood beside it, hands folded. She had not spoken aloud in over a month. The watchers gathered. 5 remained. Each watcher placed a hand upon the door. It opened inward. They stepped through. Floating above it, a bell. Not made of metal, but of silence itself. What they found was not another chamber, not a forest, not a place at all, but a space between places. They walked, a still pool of mirrored time. The 5 watchers stood together, hands joined. The bell tower of Elmsworth remained.